there are certain things that random groups of people have in common. They hate long lines. They know you're going to get screwed 50% of the time with your takeout order. Everybody hates Nickelback. And there's confusion about wearing masks.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories.
So here's my story. And it, or I should say they, because there are actually two kind of stories, come to you from the road because as you know, my son is a senior at Colorado Boulder. And so he has a job in New Mexico as a backcountry ranger this summer, which meant that he can't take his dog with him. So for various reasons, chief among them that the airlines aren't allowing you to ship dogs anymore, not that we really wanted to do that. We flew from Baltimore to Denver, picked up his dog, and then we drove back across the country. And we did that this past weekend.
Tantalizing.
Oh, Nebraska alone is just everything it's cracked up to be.
Like if you really want to zone out and have nothing on your mind.
Yeah, and for hours on end. So a couple observations from which the stories arise. The first one is that I think Southwest Airlines completely forgot how to fly during the pandemic.
Oh, no.
And there were just every facet of the journey they just did wrong in a very non-Southwest way. But here's the one I want to focus on. This flight was 100% full. So forget about that eliminating the middle seat thing. It was 100% full, every seat taken. So we packed into the plane, as you do, and got settled, had the 5-hour flight to Denver. We landed, stopped on the runway because they didn't know what gate they were going to. So we remained stopped for 20 minutes. They finally chose a gate. They went to the gate, but they announced that there was no jetway driver to get that thing out from the gate to the plane. Right. Mm-hmm. So we sat for another half an hour. So we were on the ground for about 50 minutes after the plane landed. And then they made the announcements that personal belongings may shift during the flight. So be careful opening the overhead compartments.
Sure.
And here's where it got interesting. They said, listen, as you're deplaning, as you know, you deplane from the front. So don't everybody stand up in the aisle at once to get your baggage. Just stand up by row, as your row is about to deplane and retrieve it, because we really value social distancing and we don't want you hovering over people. Now, we've spent 6 hours in a plane
crammed,
like sardines.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And now is when Southwest gave an announcement, and they expanded on this, that they care deeply about social distancing and our health.
What's weird about that is, if I'm not mistaken, that's not a recorded thing. So it's not like
live.
It's right. So like someone is physically like using their active current in the moment brain to say this thing, looking at a group of people crammed into an airplane versus I could imagine if there was a recorded something that hasn't been updated since they've started filling the middle seat, blah, blah, blah. Still a problem, but understandable. Whereas this, when you're like looking at a crowd of people going, we value your distancing. How do you do that?
And so I told you I had a couple stories, but they all have a common bond, which is the common bond I saw among strangers. And this is the first one because you could see a collective eye roll among like over 100 people as people who never knew each other turned to their neighbor and was like, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah.
I mean,
are they on this plane?
Because we are packed. And it's not like you're sitting there with a lot of shoulder room and everybody has this. You're not in Barca loungers. Right. You're just in these tiny little seats. And so they announced they care about social distancing. And I started thinking about, what happens and the result when companies only fake care about the reasoning for their policies? Because if they really cared about social distancing, they would have kept the no middle seat policy or something like that. But that would have impacted their revenue. Mm-hmm. So what they just did was to announce. Now, also understand in the Denver airport, when you get to the gate, in order to get to the terminal, you take a train that is cram packed.
Right. Yeah.
To get to the terminal. So That was the first thing, the collective eye roll. The second thing, and then I'll just go on, is as we're driving across the country, I went into a convenience store and get a couple bottles of water, and I'm wearing a mask, and there's a line, and so the guy in front of me, this is in Nebraska, and he's wearing this cowboy hat, and he looks every bit like Nebraska, and he turned and he goes, "Hey, are masks required?" And I said, "I honestly don't know." I said, in Colorado, where we came from, they said that if you're fully vaccinated, then no mask. But I said, "I didn't know." He goes, "Yeah, I didn't know either." He said, wherever he was coming from, they did the same thing, fully vaccinated, no mask. He said, and then he said, "I feel like taking my vaccinated card, my fully vaccinated card, and just showing it around like Wayne's World backstage at the Alice Cooper concert. Is this cool? Is this cool? Is this cool?" And we were laughing about it. And that was such a great moment for me, because again, much like the collective eye roll on Southwest, it reminded me when I'm watching all the news and stuff about how fractured the country is, there are still common ties that bind us together. Mm-hmm. And it's the common culture. And so seeing this guy and just talking about the uncertainty of the mask rule and the ridiculous nature of the thought process you have to go through, and how people and companies are kind of trying to find their way in these uncertain times, I just thought it was the commonality of what everybody's going through is kind of reassuring.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's nothing like those moments of like, it's funny, the story that popped to mind for me was also like an airplane kind of thing. We were landing in Florida and in Orlando, and I don't know what was going on, but I'm not super afraid of flying. It doesn't give me a lot of anxiety, and I had white knuckle fingers into the seat as we were coming into land, because we were tipping, and this is a visual, but we're doing way to the right and then way to the left. And out the windows, you could just see there's the sun and there's the land and there's the sun. And it was actually nausea inducing. It was so bad. And we came in faster than I have ever, there was, you sort of feel yourself going lower, lower, lower. You could see the land approaching, and we were still going very fast, and they were just trying to control the plane. And when it landed, literally you couldn't hear, the whole place was just silent. And they landed. And when there's that, wonderful sound of it's not brakes, but whatever, the reverse engine zinger, where they're as they slow you down, the entire plane broke out in that very, very, very specific nervous laughter, where everyone was like, it was just the whole plane. And it was just, and we all started looking at each other oh, okay. Because even people who were not at all afraid of flying were freaking out, because it was my husband does not get freaked out by flying, and he was looking at me oh my goodness. And there was something and then we all started chatting and talking to each other, and whereas before we weren't. And so what anyone who's listening, it's what does this have to do with business? I think it reminds me of what is so easily missed about any conversation about culture, which is that culture isn't something, none of those examples that you just cited or that came to mind for me have anything, we're not organized by, catalyzed by, sparked by a poster or a mission statement or an organized team activity. They just happened in the interstitial moments of shared experiences and shared wins and shared goals and shared fates. A lot of times these stories come around things that aren't going so well, and that sense of, that airplane ride I mentioned sort of felt like it was going to be that story of we had a shared investment in the moment. And those experiences, I think, really knit people together extremely fast, even strangers.
They do. And being able to understand that and tap into it, I think, is a real talent. There was a hotel that we stayed in, and it was just one of these roadside hotels. I can't remember, honestly, whether it was Hampton Inn or something like that. But it was a pet-friendly roadside hotel. And once again, with the mask policy, you could see people in the lobby, had their masks. Some actually were holding their mask, but it wasn't committed, over their ears or just holding it up. Some were just, and everybody's looking around, and most of the people had masks in their hand and do you put it on? Some had it over the chin, and there were signs about mask being required. But the woman behind the desk, and this was like at 11 o'clock. And so I always associate these, she might have just gotten on at 9, but it was 11 in the evening, and I figured she was tired and full day, whatever.
Right, because you're tired. You assume
I was tired.
exhausted.
I assumed everybody was. And we all had like the 1,000-yard stare of a combat veteran. And anyway, she goes from the desk, she looks out and she goes, yeah, we don't really know either. And everybody started laughing. He goes, and then she followed up. She goes, here's my best guess. They say if you're fully vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask. Nobody knows. How about this? Put on the mask, because if there's somebody that's really worried about it, then everybody's cool.
Yeah.
And so everybody was like, oh, okay. There was none of these protests like, how dare you ask me to put on a mask? It was just the certainty that, okay, these are the rules here.
Oh, okay. You just brought up a whole other point that I want to come back to in a second. But I think part of it too is like, I've had a couple, it hasn't actually happened to me yet, although I did get a nasty look from a lady at one point. But I do have some friends who have had some pretty harrowing experiences of someone feeling weirdly compelled to lay into them because they were wearing a mask, which I don't like. If I'm insisting that you wear a mask and you get mad, like, I don't understand it, but I understand it. Why anyone cares if someone else is wearing one, I really don't understand, especially enough to be like aggressively, threat-inducingly angry at somebody. That I just don't understand. So that's a whole different kind of conversation about what gets dripped into the culture when you have those kinds of shared experiences, like unpleasantly shared experiences in a moment, because that doesn't knit you together. That actually sends you further apart.
Right.
And those things happen in those moments of culture as well, like these little tiny things that you might not even notice that send people further away from each other instead of closer together. But you brought up something just now that I think also really pertains to culture. And it's sometimes, and it's these moments where sometimes it's less about the right answer or the wrong answer and just taking away the ambiguity so that there's one less thing to think about. So it's like, it almost doesn't matter. Like, we don't know, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, but you know what, how about we just put them on and then deal with it from there. Now, there could easily be people who say, I don't, other things can come up there, but I still think there's something to be said. But that's kind of the point. It's not necessarily always about right or wrong, and it's not always necessarily around getting everyone to be really happy with the answer. That what's important for the company or the organization or the moment is just for there to be clarity that works in the moment enough to take that layer off of confusion.
Yeah, and I think that it's kind of like it's kind of like what I think about as micro leadership. Most leadership that I tend to think about is for the big overarching questions. Here's our overarching strategy, and here's whatever. But sometimes,
here's how we'll change the world.
Yes, here's how I would change the world. And we've talked about the fact that the function of a leader is to put a stake in the ground and say, we're going here. That's the overall leadership. But sometimes it's just micro leadership, like the woman at the hotel desk who was like, for this small issue right now, here today, I'm not making a corporate decision, but this is what we're all going to do. And there was some certainty there. And there's also a common bond. She recognized that pretty much everybody was unsure. And so she decided that when you recognize that everybody was unsure, just right then, what you have to do, because and all of these things on the road, I saw a lot of the commonalities. I mean, there are certain things that random groups of people have in common. They hate long lines. They know you're going to get screwed 50% of the time with your takeout order. Yeah. Everybody hates Nickelback. And there's confusion about wearing masks. And so to be able to feel empowered as anybody in the organization, to take charge in that one moment, to recognize the common bond of uncertainty there, or the commonality of it, and to address it, I thought was really just as interesting as the strategic, we're going here to change the world decision.
Well, also because if you really start to unpack what might seem like an incredibly silly example of that moment in that hotel with that line of people trying to decide, it really does, if you really pick apart the pieces, Okay. When I say it in absolutes, I can think of like 10 reasons that maybe this wasn't the case, but let's just simplify it by speaking in absolutes. No one in that line was asking that question because they were saying, what is the scientifically safe answer in this moment? That wasn't their current concern.
Right.
They were wondering, what are the rules? They were actually wondering, what are the rules in this moment or that moment? Because if they had said, like, you don't have to wear a mask if you don't want to, anyone who wanted to would have continued wearing their mask, presumably, as long as they didn't feel threatened, whatever. And then some people might have taken them off. They weren't, I actually had a really good point here. Now I'm doing a terrible job articulating it. They weren't asking the question of what does the science say in that moment. They were they were concerned about they were concerned about doing right by other people or doing the right thing or fitting in or not doing the wrong thing or not being in trouble. Like they were looking for social cues and they were looking for social guidance in that moment about what was the right thing in this moment. They weren't asking the bigger science question in that moment, I think is what I was trying to get at.
No, that's true.
Yeah. And I can map that to a lot of situations where sometimes the uncertainty or the ambiguity, the reason it needs leadership is it really is only asking about that micro moment in that moment. Obviously, that layers into a much bigger question that asks much bigger questions, but that's not the kind of leadership that people were looking around for in that moment.
No, and I think that what that really highlights is that it's not necessarily a strategic decision. It's not a science decision. It's not just a business decision, but this is a decision that is more based on sociology, on social cues. And as opposed to a lot of other decisions that we make, which are business strategy oriented, this is the first one. Everything associated with COVID and the way back and rejoining society and interacting with people is more a people social decision than it is a business decision.
Yeah. And when you find yourself, I mean, I'm thinking of a couple examples. One is when I went away to college, and the other is when I went to a super, super, super fancy pants country club with a friend for the very first time, both of which, in my experience, I encountered, I'm making air quote, like rules that I wasn't accustomed to. Like they were in both cases, my college experience, it was just, my roommates who had rules about what you do and don't do in a living space that I was unfamiliar with. They were things I'd never even heard of. I'm like, I didn't even know that was a thing to not do or to do, just like weird. In retrospect, I'm like, that's a weird one, but it doesn't matter. It's still something that they prefer. Like I had one roommate who had these rules about where in the tub you should keep your razors. And I was like, she's like, who keeps leaving their razor? I'm like, that's a rule. I didn't even know that was a thing I could get in trouble for. And not so much that it's a rule that I had to take on, but it clearly mattered to her. And therefore I wanted to try and be somewhat respectful, but I had no idea that anyone cared about that sort of thing. Same at this country club had some rules that like went beyond just your basic etiquette. I mean, I know how to eat properly and whatnot, but they had certain rules that I was like, that's not a normal rule. You should post that stuff so people don't get their fingers slapped for going about their day in a way that I've always joked that the whole time I was there, I felt like they might come over and be like, excuse me, Miss Hume, but here we hold our drinks in our left hand. Could you please just move your drink to your left hand? I'm like, no one told me.
Well, as Patrick from SpongeBob once said, when in doubt, pinky out.
I got that part. No, but that social, the social awareness, in organizations, so much starts to like, this is how we do it. This is what matters here. Those things are all picked up and really, maybe not completely unconscious, but they're picked up in these little moments where you're watching other people and how do people react and what gets you in, again, air quotes, like in trouble. I mean, we've joked about this a little bit many, many, many moons ago in I think it was the care and feeding I think it was called something about the care and feeding episode where we were talking about like quirks. And at my old architecture firm, whenever we had a new front office person, I had this list of things that I would tell them about certain people. Like we had one principal who just had this thing about paper clips. he had a thing about paper clips that made him furious if you use paper clips. And I understand why his whole thing was like, because sometimes they grab other papers that you don't mean to, and then they get stuck, you end up sending a paper with the wrong thing. And so I understood it, but his reaction to them was irrational. And I didn't want her to step on that landmine and get yelled at and without be like, just don't use paper clips. So those kinds of things people pick up in micro, whether it's micro leadership or micro organizational guidance. And I think that's, being aware of how people learn what matters in your organization is often a very micro thing more than a macro thing.
But see, with the paperclip staple thing, you had a while to get used to that. Here we have a changing landscape, which means that so in my firm, for example, we decided, okay, we're coming back, and we've talked about that it's not full-time just like it was pre-pandemic. Some people have staggered schedules, but there are times when we're all going to be in person. That's fine. We figured that out. And we've gotten our firm meetings down, and we've gotten that taken care of. But then you have a couple other rules that are still coming up. For example, when a client or somebody says, hey, can I come in and meet with you in person? Mm-hmm. First, the decision is that a yes or is that a no, we're not doing that? But then if it's a yes, because we're back, then do you
make the decision based on client?
That's right. Based on client.
No. Just kidding.
But then if you decide yes, do I, because we're a small organization and we're in one space, do I then have to announce to people, hey, look, I'm having a client from outside our quote bubble, come in person. So if that makes you uneasy, then you should know and make your own decision. So that's one issue that's just coming up because I don't know. A second thing is I got a text from one of our folks that said, hey, I have a headache and kind of a sore throat. Do you think I should come in? Now, normally they would always come in. I can't even think of a time when they didn't come in and do whatever. And that's kind of like a badge of courage or heroism, whatever. But now she's asking me because she knows that she could come in, but she also knows that her decision more than anything, affects other people. I know it always had the theoretical possibility of affecting other people, but now it's so high in your consciousness.
Yeah, it's been elevated up to. I was just reminded of those. If you've seen those really cool graphics where they'll map out like the number one band at a given time, or like the richest people in the world, where it starts in a year and the sideways bar graph goes as people like, it's like that issue of like germiness has gone where, and that's been an interesting thing of, having to call it on times where you're like, I don't even have a fever. I'm just like, my head hurts and I like, it feels stupid canceling a thing, but you're like, I guess I have to cancel.
Look, I have to tell you, being a person over 50, sometimes I will sit there and there's this random pain that comes along and I'm like, oh, so I guess this is how it ends. You just think, is it just a cramp, or is this the start of something that this is the end? So you sit there with the call there or the text that I got saying I have a sore throat, and she's like, I think it's a sore throat, and it could be related to, I don't know, the pollen count, and I was sneezing,
which has been super high this year. So or it could be the start of a super spreader event, and I didn't want to make that call alone. So what do you think? Right. I saw a Facebook post of a friend not too long ago who was sharing their own memory from many, many years ago of them posting on Facebook something about, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something like drug myself to work with 103-degree fever and a headache and a cough, found out later I had the flu, poor me, like the actual flu, and she had reforwarded and she was like, that day when you realize what an a-hole you used to be. She's like, what a jerk move of me to go to work with 104 fever.
But what she was thinking, but I'm sure what she was thinking is, well, I'm not going to let the team down. I'm not going to stay back. I'm doing this. I'd rather stay in bed, but I'm doing this for the team. Right.
Exactly. I am bringing my influenza for the team also have. But that's just it. Like we have a different set of priorities that, I don't think we have any, well, we don't have any choice but to navigate together. That doesn't mean, I started to say we don't have any choice to talk about and figure out together. There are a lot of places where that won't happen and it will just be decided, but we're still all then affected by it. And, trying to understand, like, does it matter to Lacey or Kim if you have somebody in?
Yeah.
Maybe they don't care who comes, maybe it can come in categories. Well, as long as you're just having them in the conference room, I don't care. But if you're going to have 80 people in our space, right, tightly packed in like a Southwest flight, then I do care. I don't want to be here for that. Or just trying to kind of understand where there are rules that you maybe wouldn't have had before and not knowing how other people feel about it.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, and this is a subject for another day, but from the legal point of view, it also brings in, let's say that I said, stay home, which I in fact did. I said, look, if you're not feeling well, the text was last night. If you're not feeling well tomorrow morning, then just stay home. Take care of yourself. You can work from home as you always have been, so don't worry about it. But at the same time, from the legal point of view, if we were this type of organization and a larger organization, I'd be like, is that a sick day? Because she could say, I don't want to take one of my sick days. I'm going to come in. So that's a whole different issue.
It's a whole different issue. And it's one that we could do a whole episode on, but we can't right now because we're going to be wrapping this one up shortly. But I have had a lot of clients, both in my roundtables as well as like individual conversations, bringing up this topic of like, because you can work from home and most places are set up to be able to, in industries where you can do that, obviously, what happens to sick days, PTO time? Like, what does PTO time even mean if you can be at your vacation house and still get all your work done? Or, and vacation is different than sick leave, but a lot of places lob it all together as PTO time that you're just supposed to sort out for yourself. And so the meaning of those things is changing, I think, at least a lot of places. And again, the questions are being asked, how are we going to handle that? And what matters? I love it because it makes you, it's almost like going through a drawer in your house or something. You have to go through and like a lot of stuff gets shoved in there just because that's where it is. And you have to take it all out and decide, does this matter to me? And why does this matter to me? Like, yes, we need some amount of regulation about how much people are working or whatever, probably, but what do we care about and what matters and what doesn't matter and what problem are we solving? That's the part that I think gets missed sometimes, is like a white knuckle adherence to, we need this rule so that one person out of 100 doesn't abuse the whatever, versus sort of stepping back and saying, well, what problems? Well, we want to be able to all have meetings at least, there needs to be some period of the day where we are all available. Okay, well, what if that's the middle of the day? Whatever the answer is, finding ways to make sure you're solving the problems you have and not just having rules for rules' sake.
So because you're right, that's a whole separate episode on PTO and sick days, and we can't have that conversation right now, right here. Where could people extend that conversation, Jody?
Well, thank you for asking, Elliot. You're doing such a good job, by the way, of remembering to bring this up. I'm so impressed. And last time you did it, not even at the end of the episode.
I know.
So there's a chance people actually heard it. So there's two ways. One, you can try out our cool new texting service, which we're going to hopefully start using more soon, which is if you text us at 410-632-6894, then, and make sure you do the little second step when they send you the thing to like add your contact information, or we won't get your first text. But after that, we can text back and forth. You can let us know what you think of any particular little segment of any show, or ask a question, or tell us your own story. The other way you can do that is at sohere'smystory.com. You can find a link to get in our text stream, as well as a link to the Facebook group where we have been having several conversations about these kinds of things. So,
all right. So we will see you there. Hopefully.
See you there.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.